Mr. President, we thank UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Tom Fletcher and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell for their briefings on the scale of the ongoing Palestinian civilian tragedy in the Gaza Strip. Day after day, the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is breaking new anti-records. The population of the enclave lives in conditions of a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe, faces unimaginable deprivation and hunger, from which adults and children die. At the same time, despite the active efforts of humanitarian agencies and their almost unanimous support from the Security Council members, humanitarian aid, on which all residents of the enclave are forced to depend, are arriving in extremely limited volumes, clearly incomparable with the scale of the disaster. The situation is rapidly deteriorating against the backdrop of a critical shortage of fuel, necessary for the functioning of basic infrastructure. Without it, hospitals, water systems, and food outlets could be completely paralyzed, putting the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians at risk. Of particular concern are reports of a possible shutdown of desalination plants. It is unacceptable that Gazans, especially children, are left without access to drinking water. The collapse of the water supply system could also lead to outbreaks of infectious diseases, further exacerbating the humanitarian situation. Mr. President, the IDF's ongoing ground operations and shelling throughout the Gaza Strip create truly intolerable conditions for the survival of the civilian population. We strongly condemn attacks that kill and injure civilians. Particularly disturbing is the persistent and increasingly pronounced nature of attacks on places where people gather in search of food, including distribution centers. According to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 798 Palestinians have died in the enclave while trying to receive humanitarian aid since the end of May this year. We note with particular concern the large number of casualties near the centers associated with the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, a mechanism that, as many of us have warned in this hall, instead of solving humanitarian problems, is becoming a symbol of humiliation of human dignity and a threat to the lives of those who need help. Hundreds of people who have died trying to get help from Palestinians are grim testimony to this. The work of this mechanism is dangerous for the recipients of assistance and morally unacceptable. We are convinced that the UN Secretariat has made an absolutely correct and responsible decision not to become an accomplice in this essentially punitive scheme, masquerading as a humanitarian operation. Recall that just recently, more than 200 non-governmental organizations issued a joint call to stop the work of the bloody paramilitary mechanism, in which Palestinians are offered an unthinkable choice: to die of hunger or in line for rations. Unfortunately, despite all this, Israel and the United States continue to consider this mechanism effective, flaunting a multi-million-dollar amount of food rations that are allegedly given to civilians, not Hamas. These statements are at least controversial and are in no way confirmed by the real situation in the sector. At the same time, one thing is clear: if Israel had facilitated rather than hindered the supply of humanitarian aid through the UN, there would have been at least a faint hope for a weakening of the humanitarian crisis. Today, we are completely deprived of it, and the massive collective punishment of Palestinians in violation of basic IHL continues before our eyes. Mr. President, we are appalled by the recent targeting of civilians in Deir al-Balah who were trying to access food assistance provided by UNICEF. Dozens of people were killed and wounded in the attack. Among the dead are 9 Palestinian children. Already on July 13th in the New Seret camp, according to the UN, 7 more children were killed while standing in line for water at a humanitarian distribution point. These tragedies are becoming frighteningly commonplace. We strongly condemn the killing of innocent civilians who only wanted to receive the life-saving assistance they needed. Such attacks undermine the very possibility of saving human lives and constitute a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Regrettably, humanitarian workers continue to be killed. Another airstrike on the office of one of the humanitarian organizations, carried out on July 10th in Gaza City, claimed the lives of 3 more humanitarian workers. This tragic incident once again confirms the extremely high level of risk that humanitarian workers face in carrying out their duty in the face of constant danger. In parallel with the reprisals against humanitarian workers and journalists covering the events in Gaza, real harassment has been unleashed against undesirable UN structures. First of all, this applies to UNRWA, an agency that has been providing support to Palestinians in the fields of humanitarian assistance, education, and healthcare for many decades. Its uninterrupted and sustainable operation is the key to the survival of millions of Palestinians, living not only in the Gaza Strip but, as is well known, in neighboring countries hosting refugees. We emphasize that there has never been and cannot be an alternative to UNRWA. Following UNRWA and the UN Secretary-General, the relevant special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council were handed out. Such actions do not comply with the obligations of UN member states and violate the UN Charter and the Convention on Immunities and Privileges. This situation requires the most decisive international response. The protection and livelihood of civilians in the OPT is an obligation of Israel as the occupying power that is not subject to the criterion of acceptability or inadmissibility by the Israeli leadership. Regrettably, all attempts by the international community to achieve at least some compliance with the basic principles of humanity and humanity are met with the all-weather support of its ally Washington, which has given Jerusalem carte blanche to take any action against the Palestinians. Mr. President, if anyone thinks that the situation in Gaza simply cannot get any worse, they are most likely mistaken. Thus, according to incoming information, including from Israeli officials, Jerusalem is preparing a new plan to move 600,000 Palestinians to the so-called Humanitarian City in Rafah, south of the Morag military corridor. The goal is to concentrate the entire 2 million population of the enclave there in the future, after subjecting civilians to checks for ties with Hamas. UNRWA Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini has already described such a plan as the actual creation of a mass concentration camp, the Palestinian inhabitants of which will be deprived of any prospects for the future. We would like to note that former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert shares these assessments, calling this initiative part of the general campaign of the Netanyahu government to ethnic cleanse and deport Palestinians. It would be important to hear the assessments of that initiative by Ocho or UNICEF. Mr. President, unfortunately, the problems of the Palestinian population are not limited to Gaza alone. We are extremely concerned about the situation in the West Bank, where there is an increase in the intensity of operations by Israeli forces, especially in the northern regions. Jerusalem's actions are leading to large-scale destruction, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis, and depriving displaced families of hope for return. We regularly receive reports of killings and violence against Palestinians, land grabs and demolitions. This is unacceptable. We call on Israel to immediately cease violence in the occupied Palestinian territory, to guarantee the protection of the population, and not to impede the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians that they need more than ever. It is also necessary to stop the expansion and construction of settlements, provocations by settlers who demonstratively humiliate the honor and dignity of the Palestinians. Mr. President, we have all said in this room more than once that ensuring unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need in the enclave in the context of the ongoing IDF military operation is an impossible mission. In addition, it is clear to all of us that the use of force to rescue the hostages held in Gaza has proved to be ineffective. In this regard, we would like to once again call on the parties to reach ceasefire agreements as soon as possible through the efforts of mediators, which would lead to the release and exchange of all forcibly detained persons. We are convinced that there is no alternative to such a scenario, and there cannot be. This is the only way to break the vicious circle of violence and restart the Middle East peace process on a two-state basis, the ultimate goal of which is the creation of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. For many years, the Arab-Israeli confrontation has proven that there is no other peace scenario for the Middle East. In this context, we welcome the commitment of Saudi Arabia and France to hold a high-level international conference in support of the two-state solution at the end of this month, July 28-30th in New York. We plan to take an active part in it. Thank you for your attention.